Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Imagine standing in a ballroom worth $20 million, watching your husband hold another woman's hand while the crowd whispers behind your back. That was Vivian's reality. She was the dutiful wife, the silent shadow. Her husband, Richard, thought he held all the cards. His mistress, Bella, thought she had already won the crown. But neither of them knew the secret buried in the property deed, a secret that only the silent grandfather knew. Stick around, because when the truth comes out, it doesn't just spill the tea. It burns the whole house down. The invitation was embossed with gold leaf, heavy enough to double as a weapon. The 80th birthday celebration of Alistair Montgomery. It was the social event of the season in Greenwich, Connecticut. Cars were already lining up along the crushed gravel driveway. Sleek black Mercedes S-Classes, a vintage Rolls-Royce Phantom, and the occasional ostentatious red Ferrari. Vivian sat at her vanity in the guest wing of the Montgomery estate. She wasn't in the master suite. Her husband, Richard, had told her that the master suite was being renovated and that the paint fumes were too toxic. It was a lie, of course. Vivian knew that he had been sleeping in there for weeks, often with company that wasn't her. She looked at her reflection. At 32, Vivian still had the porcelain skin and soft, doe-like eyes that had made Richard pursue her 5 years ago. But the light in them was dim now. She wore a simple, navy blue velvet gown. It was elegant, vintage Dior. But compared to the glittering peacocks downstairs, she knew she would look plain. "Are you ready yet?" The voice cut through the air like a whip. Richard stood in the doorway. He looked handsome in his bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo, but his face was twisted in that perpetual sneer of impatience he reserved solely for her. "Almost," Vivian said softly, reaching for a necklace. It was a modest string of pearls. Richard sighed, checking his Patek Philippe watch. "God, Vivian, try to look a little more alive. Tonight is important. The board is watching. Grandfather is making the announcement regarding the inheritance of the estate and the CEO position of Montgomery Holdings. I need you to play the part of the happy, supportive wife. Can you manage that?" "I always do, Richard," she replied, clasping the pearls. "Good. And listen," he stepped closer, adjusting his cufflinks. "Bella is coming tonight." Vivian's hands froze. "Bella, your executive assistant?" "She organized the event, Vivian. She has to be there to manage the catering staff and the press. Don't start with your jealousy. It's pathetic." Vivian turned to face him. "Is it jealousy, Richard? Or is it dignity? You're bringing your mistress to your grandfather's birthday." Richard laughed, a cold, dry sound. "Technically, this is my house, or it will be in about 2 hours. I can bring whoever I want. Just stay out of her way. She's stressed." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked out, leaving the door open. Vivian stared at the empty doorway. She took a deep breath, smoothing the velvet of her dress. She reached into her drawer and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was a note, written in shaky handwriting. "Patience, my dear. The loudest thunder comes after the quietest lightning." She tucked the note into her clutch. She didn't need Richard's permission to exist. Not tonight. The ballroom was a sea of old money. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the guests. Waiters in white gloves moved silently through the crowd, offering trays of Bollinger champagne and caviar blinis. Vivian stood near a pillar, nursing a glass of sparkling water. She watched Richard working the room. He was charming, charismatic, shaking hands with senators and tech moguls. He looked like the perfect heir. Then the doors opened, and the air in the room seemed to change. Bella walked in. She wasn't wearing the attire of an executive assistant. She was wearing a dress that screamed for attention, a bright scarlet Versace gown with a slit that went dangerously high up her thigh. It was tight, revealing, and completely inappropriate for a somber 80th birthday party. Her blonde hair was styled in loose, voluminous waves, and she wore diamonds that Vivian recognized. They were earrings Richard had claimed were lost during their trip to the Maldives last year. A murmur went through the crowd. The older ladies of the Greenwich Historical Society clutched their pearls. The men raised their eyebrows. Bella didn't care. She scanned the room, locked eyes with Richard, and smiled. A predatory, confident grin. She walked straight toward him, ignoring the guests she bumped into. "Richard!" she exclaimed, her voice just a little too loud. She placed a hand intimately on his bicep. The florist was a nightmare, but I handled it. Richard looked nervous but pleased. "Good work, Bella. Everyone, you know Bella, my right hand at the firm." Vivian watched from the shadows. She felt a presence beside her. It was Aunt Margaret, Richard's formidable aunt, known for her sharp tongue and even sharper observation skills. "That dress is a declaration of war," Margaret muttered, sipping her martini. "She looks like she's attending a Las Vegas bachelor party, not Alistair's jubilee." "She likes red," Vivian said neutrally. "She likes your husband, dear," Margaret said, turning to look at Vivian. "And he seems to like letting her parade around. Why do you tolerate it?" "Because," Vivian said, her eyes fixed on Grandfather Alistair, who was sitting in his wheelchair in the corner, a tartan blanket over his knees. He looked frail, his head bowed. "Sometimes you have to let people show you exactly who they are." Just then, Bella spotted Vivian. Her smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. She whispered something to Richard, who looked uncomfortable but nodded. Bella grabbed 2 glasses of red wine from a passing waiter and sashayed toward Vivian. "Vivian," Bella chirped, "I didn't see you hiding there in the dark. You blend in so, well, like the curtains." Vivian stood her ground. "Hello, Bella. The event looks lovely." "It does, doesn't it?" Bella swirled the red wine in her glass. "Richard and I worked so hard on it. He has such specific tastes. But then again," she looked Vivian up and down, "I guess you know he has taste issues. That dress is charming. Did you get it at a thrift store? It smells a bit like mothballs." "It was my mother's," Vivian said quietly. "Oh, sweetie," Bella laughed, taking a step closer. "Sentimental value doesn't pay the bills. Richard needs a woman who looks like $1 billion, not a charity case. Is there something you need, Bella?" "I just wanted to make sure you were comfortable," Bella said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "It must be hard, knowing everyone here is waiting for Richard to take over the mansion. You'll probably be moved to the guest house permanently, or maybe out entirely." "We'll see," Vivian said. Bella narrowed her eyes. She took a step closer, feigning a stumble on her 6-inch stiletto heels. Whoops! It happened in slow motion. The glass of Cabernet Sauvignon in Bella's hand tilted forward. A dark, crimson wave splashed directly onto Vivian's chest, soaking the vintage blue velvet and staining the pearls Richard had bought her for their first anniversary. The room went silent. The music seemed to stop. Bella gasped, bringing a hand to her mouth in a theatrical display of shock. "Oh my God, Vivian, I am so clumsy. I'm so sorry." But Vivian saw the glint in her eyes. It was pure malice. Richard rushed over, not to help Vivian, but to grab Bella's arm. "Bella, are you okay?" "I tripped," Bella cried, looking at Richard with wide, innocent eyes. "The floor is uneven. I spilled wine all over her. Old dress." Richard looked at Vivian, who stood dripping with wine, her dignity hanging by a thread. He looked annoyed. "Vivian, go clean yourself up. You're making a scene. You look like a mess." Vivian looked at the red stain spreading over her heart. She looked at her husband, who was comforting the woman who had just humiliated her. Then she looked across the room at Grandfather Alistair. The old man lifted his head. His eyes, usually cloudy with age, were sharp as flint. He gave Vivian the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. Vivian didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply took a napkin from a nearby table, dabbed her chin, and smiled. "Don't worry, Richard," she said, her voice clear and carrying through the silent room. "It's just wine. It washes out, unlike some stains." She turned and walked out of the ballroom, head held high, leaving a trail of silence in her wake. Vivian stood in the powder room, staring at the red stain that bloomed across her chest like a gunshot wound. The cold water she dabbed on it only made the velvet turn a darker, sodden black. The door opened, and a young maid named Sarah entered. Sarah had been with the family for 2 years, and was one of the few staff members who treated Vivian with genuine kindness. "Mrs. Montgomery," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. "I saw what happened. That woman, she's wicked." "It's fine, Sarah," Vivian said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's just a dress." "It's not just a dress. It's humiliation," Sarah said, locking the door. "Wait here." Sarah disappeared and returned 2 minutes later, holding a garment bag. "I wasn't supposed to have this. Mr. Alistair, your grandfather-in-law, he had me pick this up from the cleaners yesterday. He said it belonged to his late wife, Helena. He said, 'Keep it safe for a rainy day.' I think a wine storm counts as rain." Vivian unzipped the bag. Inside was a floor-length gown of midnight blue silk, structured and regal, with a high neck and long sleeves. It was modest yet commanding, the kind of dress a queen wears to a coronation. It fit Vivian perfectly. When Vivian re-entered the ballroom, the atmosphere had shifted. The hors d'oeuvres were cleared, and the guests were seated for the gift presentation, a narcissistic tradition Richard had instated to show off his wealth to his grandfather. Bella was seated right next to Richard at the head table, her hand resting possessively on his knee. Vivian's seat had been moved to the far end, next to a deaf second cousin. Richard stood up, tapping a spoon against his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Tonight is about honoring the patriarch of our family, Alistair. And to show our appreciation, we have prepared some tokens of our love." Richard went first. He snapped his fingers, and 2 assistants brought forward a large box. He opened it to reveal a Patek Philippe Grandmaster chime watch. "Grandfather," Richard boomed, "this watch is worth $3 million. It represents the timeless legacy you've built, which I will continue." Alistair looked at the watch with tired eyes. "Time is the one thing money cannot buy, Richard. But thank you." Then it was Bella's turn. She stood up, the slit in her red dress falling open. She gestured to a covered easel. "Alistair," she purred, dropping the formality of Mr. Montgomery. "I commissioned this from the finest artist in Soho." She pulled the sheet down. It was a massive oil painting of the mansion. However, in the painting, the figures standing on the balcony were clearly Richard and Bella. Vivian was nowhere to be seen. "It represents the future," Bella said, beaming. "Bright, bold, and unburdened by the past." The crowd applauded politely, though some exchanged awkward glances. It was a brazen statement. She was painting herself into the family history before the ink on the divorce papers was even wet. "And finally," Richard said, his tone bored, "Vivian, do you have anything? Or did you forget, given your wardrobe malfunction?" Vivian stood up. The midnight blue silk caught the light, and for a moment Richard looked struck by how regal she looked. She walked to Alistair without a box. She carried only a small, leather-bound book. "I didn't spend millions, grandfather," Vivian said softly. "And I didn't hire an artist." She placed the book on his lap. Alistair opened it with shaking hands. It wasn't a photo album, it was a journal. "You told me once that you forgot your mother's recipe for apple brown, Betty," Vivian said, "and that you couldn't remember the exact coordinates of the hill where you proposed to Helena. I spent the last 6 months tracking down your old neighbours in Scotland and going through the town archives. The recipe is on page 1. The coordinates and a photo of the hill from 1945 are on page 2. The room went deadly silent. Alistair's hand trembled as he touched the old photograph. A single tear leaked from his eye. He looked up at Vivian, his expression unreadable, but his jaw set firm. "Sentimental trash," Bella whispered, loudly enough for the front tables to hear. She laughed, a tinkling, cruel sound. "We're talking about the CEO of a global conglomerate, and she gives him a cookie recipe? This is why she doesn't belong here, Richard. She thinks small." Richard chuckled, shaking his head. "It's a sweet effort, Vivian. A bit rustic. But thank you for trying." He dismissed her with a wave of his hand. "Now, on to the main event. The announcement regarding the estate." Vivian sat back down, her face burning. But as she looked at Alistair, she saw him close the book gently and place his hand over it, protecting it. The dinner service began, a 7-course affair of truffles and lobster. Vivian, feeling suffocated by the pretense, slipped away from the table between the 3rd and 4th courses. She needed air. She walked down the long, mahogany-panelled hallway toward the library. She intended to sit in the dark for a moment, but as she approached the heavy oak doors, she heard voices. "I can't wait another week, Richard. She's like a ghost, haunting my house." It was Bella. Vivian froze. The door was cracked open an inch. "Keep your voice down," Richard hissed. "The lawyers have the papers drawn up. Arthur says that if we present the divorce papers after grandfather signs the deed transfer tonight, she gets nothing. The prenuptial agreement has a clause about marital assets acquired during the marriage. The mansion is an inheritance. It won't be marital property. She walks away with the clothes on her back." Vivian pressed her hand over her mouth. They weren't just planning to leave her. They were planning to destroy her financially. "And the grandfather?" Bella asked. "He's looking sturdy. I thought you said he was senile." "He's old," Richard scoffed. "He barely knows what day it is. He liked that stupid scrapbook because he's stuck in the past. Once he signs the power of attorney and the deed over to me tonight, we can put him in that facility in Vermont. The Sunset Home. It's out of the way." "Good," Bella said. "I don't want a wheelchair scratching up these hardwood floors. I'm going to redo this whole library. White marble, modern art. Get rid of all these dusty books. Whatever you want, baby. Once he signs, I'm the king, and you're the queen." There was the sound of glass clinking. A toast. "To us," Bella said, "and to taking out the trash." Vivian felt a cold rage settle in her stomach. It wasn't the sadness she had felt earlier. It was something sharper. Ice. She realized then that her silence had been interpreted as weakness. Her loyalty had been seen as stupidity. She backed away from the door silently, her heels sinking into the plush Persian runner. She didn't run away. She walked back toward the ballroom. As she entered the hall, she ran into Arthur, the family lawyer. He was a small, nervous man who was clutching a leather briefcase. "Mrs. Montgomery," Arthur stammered. "Arthur," Vivian said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. Does the grandfather know? Know what? Arthur sweated. That Richard plans to put him in a home in Vermont at the moment the ink is dry? Arthur paled. I just follow instructions, Mrs. Montgomery. I have a duty to my client. Your client is Alistair Montgomery, Vivian reminded him. Not Richard. Not yet. She leaned in close. You better make sure the papers are in order, Arthur, because if there is a single mistake tonight, I will make sure the Bar Association hears about how you colluded to defraud a senior citizen. Arthur looked like he was about to be sick. He nodded hurriedly and rushed into the ballroom. Vivian smoothed her blue dress. She wasn't the victim anymore. She was the witness, and the trial was about to begin. The clinking of silverware stopped as the lights dimmed. A spotlight hit the head table. Richard stood up, looking flushed with wine and victory. And now, the moment we have all been waiting for. The man who started it all. My grandfather, Alistair Montgomery. Richard applauded enthusiastically, and Bella joined in, clapping her hands high in the air like a seal. Alistair wheeled himself to the microphone. He declined Richard's offer to help him stand. He adjusted the mic, the feedback screeching for a second, making Bella wince and cover her ears theatrically. 80 years, Alistair rasped. His voice was weak, but it carried a strange resonance. I have built this company from a garage in Brooklyn to a skyscraper in Manhattan. I have bought houses in Paris, London, and here in Greenwich. Hear, hear, Richard shouted, raising his glass. Alistair didn't look at him. I have spent my life accumulating value, stocks, bonds, real estate. But as the end of my tenure approaches, I have been forced to ask myself, what is the real owner of a legacy? He looked out at the crowd. Is it the one who carries the name? Alistair asked. Or is it the one who carries the honor? The room was silent. Richard looked confused. This wasn't the speech he had written for the old man. My grandson, Richard, Alistair said, gesturing to him. Richard puffed out his chest. You have run the company for 2 years as acting CEO. Profits are up 10%. 12%, Richard corrected, grinning. And morale is down 40%, Alistair added. Richard's smile faltered. And you, Bella, Alistair continued, turning his gaze to the woman in red. Bella started, surprised to be addressed. She put on her best charming smile. Yes, Alistair? You have organized a beautiful party. You have managed the staff with vigor. Thank you, Bella preened. You have also, Alistair said, his voice hardening, spilled wine on my granddaughter-in-law, insulted her dress, and mocked a gift that meant more to me than your entire portfolio. The room gasped. A collective intake of breath sucked the air out of the ballroom. Bella's mouth dropped open. Oh, don't look shocked, Alistair snapped, his voice suddenly strong, booming with the authority of the tycoon he once was. I may be in a wheelchair, but I am not deaf, and I am certainly not blind. Richard stood up abruptly. Grandfather, you're tired. You've had too much champagne. Let's get you to bed. Arthur, bring the papers. We'll sign them in private. Sit down, boy, Alistair roared. Richard froze. He hadn't been yelled at like that since he was 12. He slowly sat down. We will sign the papers right now, Alistair said, in front of everyone. Arthur, bring the deed to the mansion and the transfer of control for Montgomery Holdings. Arthur, sweating profusely, scurried forward and placed the documents on the table in front of Alistair. This mansion, Alistair said, picking up a heavy fountain pen, has been in the family for 4 generations. It requires an owner who understands that a house is not a showroom. It is a sanctuary. He looked at Richard. Richard, you told your mistress in the library, yes, the library has an intercom system, you idiot, that you plan to ship me off to Vermont. Bella turned pale. Richard looked like he had been slapped. Grandfather, that was a joke, a misunderstanding, Richard stammered. Silence, Alistair commanded. He looked at Vivian. She was sitting quietly, her hands folded in her lap, the blue silk dress flowing around her. Vivian, Alistair said, his voice softening. You have been the only person in this house who hasn't asked me for money. You're the only one who asked me how I felt. You cleaned my glasses when my hands were too arthritic. You read to me when my eyes failed. And tonight, you stood tall while these vultures picked at you. Alistair uncapped the pen. Richard, you wanted the house. You wanted the title. It's my birthright, Richard shouted, losing his composure. I am the only male heir. Being a man is about character, Richard, Alistair said coldly. And you are a child. Alistair signed the document with a flourish. He handed the paper to Arthur. Read it, Arthur. Out loud. Arthur's hands shook so hard the paper rattled. He adjusted his glasses and looked at the signature, then at the name printed on the beneficiary line. Arthur swallowed hard. The deed to the Montgomery estate in Greenwich, along with the controlling 51% stake in Montgomery Holdings. Arthur paused, looking at Richard with terror. Transferred to whom? Richard screamed, slamming his fist on the table. Arthur whispered the name. Transferred to Mrs. Vivian Montgomery, sole owner, effective immediately. The silence that followed Arthur's announcement was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. It hung over the ballroom like a storm cloud waiting to burst. The clinking of silverware had ceased. The hushed whispers had died. 300 of the wealthiest people on the East Coast sat frozen, their eyes darting between the frail old man in the wheelchair, the terrifyingly calm woman in blue velvet, and the man whose face was rapidly turning a shade of purple that matched the vintage Cabernet he had been drinking. For 10 agonizing seconds, Richard Montgomery simply stared at the lawyer. His brain seemed unable to process the sequence of words he had just heard. Vivian, sole owner. Immediately. Then, the dam broke. This is a joke, Richard whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of confusion and rising fury. He looked around the room, offering a manic, disbelief-laden smile to the board members at the front table. This is a joke, right? Grandfather's sense of humor, it's a test. When no one laughed, when the board members simply stared back at him with cold, calculating expressions, Richard's composure shattered. He lunged toward the table, knocking over a crystal water pitcher. The crash of glass shattering on the hardwood floor made half the room jump. Richard grabbed the deed from Arthur's trembling hands, crumpling the thick, legal-grade paper as he scanned it frantically. "You senile old bat!" Richard screamed, turning on Alistair. He waved the papers in the air like a weapon. "You can't do this! You cannot simply sign away a billion-dollar legacy to her. I am your flesh and blood. I am the Montgomery heir. I have run this company for 2 years while you sat in that chair drooling. And she is my heart," Alistair said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through Richard's shouting like a razor. He leaned back in his wheelchair, his expression one of utter contentment. "Something you seem to lack entirely, Richard. Blood makes you a relative. Loyalty makes you family. You are merely a relative." Richard looked like he was about to strike the old man. The tension was palpable. Security guards at the perimeter tensed up, hands hovering near their earpieces. But before Richard could move, Bella sprang into action. She stood up, her red Versace dress suddenly looking less like a power statement and more like a desperate costume. The predator had become the prey, and she knew it. Her eyes darted around the room, calculating the odds, realizing her golden ticket was dissolving before her eyes. She grabbed Richard's arm, her nails digging into his tuxedo jacket. "Richard, stop screaming. You look insane," she hissed, then turned to the crowd, putting on her most authoritative executive voice. "Please everyone, stay calm. Clearly Alistair is having a medical episode. He is not in his right mind." She pointed a manicured finger at Arthur. "You, lawyer, you know this is illegal. He is mentally incompetent. Look at him. He's trying to give the company to a housewife who doesn't know a balance sheet from a baking sheet. We need a doctor immediately. We can have him committed tonight. I want the papers annulled on grounds of dementia." "Excuse me?" The voice was cool, smooth, and amplified. It didn't come from the table. It came from the speakers. The room turned. Vivian had moved. While Richard was screaming and Bella was plotting, Vivian had walked quietly, almost ethereally, to the microphone stand where Alistair had given his speech. She adjusted the height, her movements precise and unhurried. She placed one hand on Alistair's shoulder, a gesture of protection and solidarity, and leaned into the mic. "Bella," Vivian said, her voice echoing through the massive hall, bouncing off the chandeliers. "I believe you are confused about who holds the power in this room." Bella let out a shrill, incredulous laugh. She stepped away from Richard, hands on her hips. "Power? Honey, holding a piece of paper doesn't give you power. I am the VP of Operations. I organized this event. I run the staff. You are just the ex-wife-to-be who got lucky with a senile old man's pen. Do not speak to me like you're my superior." Vivian didn't blink. She didn't raise her voice. She simply turned her gaze to the sweating lawyer. "Arthur," she said into the microphone, "I have a legal question." Arthur jumped, nearly dropping his briefcase. "Yes, Mrs. Montgomery." As the majority shareholder of Montgomery Holdings and the sole owner of this private estate, as dictated by the deed you just read, do I have the right to determine who is allowed on the premises? Arthur swallowed hard. He looked at Richard, whose face was a mask of shock, and then at Vivian, who looked like a statue of justice carved from ice. He realized where the wind was blowing. "Yes," Arthur stammered, his voice gaining a little strength. "Yes, Mrs. Montgomery. It is your private property. Under the laws of Connecticut, you have full discretion to revoke invitation to any guest at any time." Vivian nodded slowly. She turned back to Bella. The room was so quiet you could hear the rain beginning to tap against the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Then, Bella," Vivian said, her tone devoid of anger, replaced by a crushing indifference, "I am revoking your invitation. You are trespassing. I want you out. Now." Bella's face went white, then crimson. "You can't make me leave. Richard, tell her. Tell her she can't throw me out of our party." "Security," Vivian said. It wasn't a question. It was a command. Two large men in black suits, who had been standing by the service doors, stepped forward. They weren't the usual event security hired for the night. They were Alistair's private detail, men who had served in the military, men who had known Vivian for years, and had watched silently as she was mistreated. They had been waiting for this order all night. They moved with terrifying speed, flanking Bella on either side. "Ma'am," the lead guard, a man named Henderson, said firmly, "you need to vacate the premises." "Don't touch me!" Bella shrieked, batting Henderson's hand away. The facade of the sophisticated executive crumbled completely. "Do you know who I am? I am the future Mrs. Montgomery. I will have your jobs. I will sue you into poverty." She lunged toward Vivian, her face twisted into a snarl. "You pathetic little mouse. You think you can embarrass me? I made this family relevant again." Henderson didn't hesitate. He grabbed Bella by the upper arm, firmly, professionally, but with zero tolerance. The other guard grabbed her other arm. "Let go of me!" Bella screamed, her heels skidding on the polished parquet floor as they began to physically drag her toward the double doors. "Richard, do something! She's humiliating me! Help me!" Richard stood frozen. He looked at the deed in his hand, then at the woman screaming his name as she was hauled away like an unruly patron at a dive bar. He looked at the walls of the mansion, the Rembrandts, the silk tapestries, the sheer, overwhelming wealth that surrounded him. The gears in his head ground together. He realized the money was gone, the power was gone, the title was gone. And suddenly, the woman in the red dress, screeching obscenities at the security team, didn't look like a prize. She looked like a liability. She looked like the anchor that was dragging him down. "Richard," Bella pleaded, her voice cracking as she neared the exit. "Why aren't you helping me?" Richard turned his back on her. He adjusted his cuffs. He took a sip of someone else's wine. He didn't look at her. "You should probably go, Bella," he muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. The crowd gasped. It was the final betrayal. Even in defeat, Richard was a coward. Bella's jaw dropped. The fight went out of her, replaced by pure shock. You spineless worm! After everything I did for you, I lied to the board for you. I cooked the quarterly reports for you. And you spilled wine on the wrong woman, Alistair interjected from his wheelchair, his voice booming with delight. "Goodbye, Miss Bella." The double doors were kicked open by the guards. Bella was unceremoniously deposited onto the wet gravel of the driveway outside. The doors slammed shut, silencing her final scream of rage. The echo of the slam faded. Richard straightened his tuxedo jacket. He ran a hand through his hair, smoothing it back. He took a deep breath, composing himself. He was a salesman, after all. He knew how to pivot. He put on a shaky, charming smile, the one that had won Vivian over 5 years ago, and turned to his wife. "Well," Richard chuckled nervously, spreading his hands. "That was intense. I'm sorry about the drama, everyone. But she's gone now, Viv. Honestly, I'm glad you got rid of her. She was becoming unhinged, a distraction." He took a step toward Vivian, walking up the steps of the dais, invading her space. "Look, Grandfather had his fun. He wanted to teach me a lesson about humility, right? Message received, Grandfather. Loud and clear." He looked at Vivian with pleading, puppy dog eyes. "But we're a team, right, babe? Husband and wife, till death do us part. We can run this together. I know the business side, you own the assets. It's perfect. What's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine. That's the vow." Vivian stared at him. She looked at the man she had washed clothes for, the man she had waited up for, the man she had cried over 1,000 times. He looked so small now, so transparent. "Actually, Richard," Vivian said, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. It was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Do you remember the prenuptial agreement you made me sign the week before our wedding?" Richard blinked, confused by the change of subject. Yes, of course." Arthur drew it up. "To protect my assets. It was standard procedure." "To protect family inheritance," Vivian corrected softly. She stepped closer to him, so close he could smell the expensive perfume she had bought with her own savings. "Do you remember Clause 14, Section B? You insisted on it. You were terrified that if we divorced, I would take a piece of your future inheritance from Alistair." Richard's face went pale. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He remembered. He had been so arrogant, so sure that he would be the one inheriting billions. I don't recall the exact wording," he stammered, Vivian recited it from memory, her voice ringing clear. Clause 14. Section B. Any inheritance, property, or business interests received by either party during the course of the marriage, via will, trust, or gift, shall remain the sole and separate property of the beneficiary, and shall not be considered marital assets, subject to division in the event of separation or divorce. The implication hit Richard like a physical blow. He staggered back a step. I just inherited this estate and the company via gift, Vivian said, gesturing to the signed deed, which means, under the strict contract you wrote and forced me to sign, it's all mine, solely mine. None of it is marital property. None of it is yours. Vivian, honey, please, Richard whispered, his voice cracking. We're still married. We can work this out. Not for long, Vivian said. She reached into her clutch, the same small, battered purse she had held on to all night. She pulled out a folded document, stapled and thick. I saw Arthur earlier this morning, too, she said. I had him draft these. I was going to give them to you quietly next week, but tonight seems appropriate. She tossed the document onto the table next to the deed. It landed with a heavy thud. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Get out of my house, Richard. Richard stared at the papers. He looked at the board members, who were now openly smirking. He looked at Aunt Margaret, who raised her martini glass in a silent toast to Vivian. But where will I go? Richard whispered, panic finally setting in for real. My wallet. My credit cards are linked to the company account. Alistair cleared his throat. I cancelled those cards 10 minutes ago via the banking app on my phone. Amazing technology these days. The old man grinned. I hear there's a lovely Motel 6 on the interstate, Richard. They leave the light on for you. Though, without a card, you might have to wash dishes to pay for the room. Vivian pointed to the door. Go, before I have Henderson come back inside. Richard opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to scream, but he looked into Vivian's eyes and saw nothing there for him. No love, no hate, just emptiness. He turned, shoulders slumped, and began the long, lonely walk to the door, the sound of his footsteps the only noise in the room, until the heavy doors closed behind him, shutting him out of the world he thought he owned. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing Richard out of the world he had assumed was his birthright. Inside the ballroom, the silence that had gripped the room finally broke. It started with a nervous cough, then a murmur, and then the floodgates opened. The atmosphere transformed instantly. The same socialites who had laughed at Bella's jokes and ignored Vivian for 5 years suddenly surged forward like a tide. Vivian! Darling! It was Mrs. Vandermeer, the head of the charity committee, pushing her way to the front. I always said you had such a quiet strength. About that luncheon next Tuesday, we would be honored to have you. Mrs. Montgomery, Mr. Sterling, a senior board member who had spent the entire evening ignoring Vivian to brown-nose Richard, was now bowing slightly. Remarkable display of leadership. Truly. If you need any guidance during the transition, my firm is at your disposal. Vivian stood at the head table, her hand resting on the back of Alistair's wheelchair. She looked at the sea of eager, shifting faces. She saw them for what they were, sunflowers turning toward the brightest light. She didn't smile. She didn't bask in the adulation. She simply leaned into the microphone one last time. Thank you, everyone, she said, her voice cool and final. However, it has been a long, emotional evening for my grandfather and myself. The celebration is over. Please finish your drinks and vacate the property. The staff will see you out. A ripple of shock went through the room. You didn't just kick out the Greenwich elite. You let them drink until dawn. "You heard the lady," Aunt Margaret bellowed from the back of the room, raising her glass. "Show's over. Go home to your own mansions." Slowly the crowd dispersed. The air of judgment had been replaced by an air of fear and respect. Vivian Montgomery wasn't a doormat. She was the gatekeeper, and she had just slammed the gate. Outside, the rain had started in earnest, a cold, biting New England drizzle. Richard stood on the gravel driveway. His tuxedo was already damp. He patted his pockets frantically. No wallet. No phone. Alistair hadn't been joking. His phone had been remotely wiped and locked by the company's IT security protocol, a measure Richard himself had installed for rogue employees. He was a rogue employee. He saw a pair of tail lights fading into the mist. It was the limousine he had hired for the night. Bella was inside it. "Bella!" Richard screamed, running a few steps after the car. "Bella, wait! Come back!" The car didn't slow down. He watched as the brake lights flared briefly, not to stop, but to navigate the turn out of the estate, leaving him behind. She had taken the ride. She had probably taken the stash of emergency cash he kept in the glove compartment. Richard stopped running. He stood alone in the dark, the massive, glowing mansion looming behind him like a fortress he had failed to conquer. He checked his pockets one last time and found a single object, a crumpled paper napkin with a cocktail onions garnish wrapped in it. He sat down on the stone curb of the fountain, the rain soaking his Tom Ford suit. For the first time in his life, Richard Montgomery had absolutely nothing. Inside the mansion, the house was finally quiet. The catering staff moved silently, clearing away the debris of the battle. Vivian pushed Alistair's wheelchair through the French doors and out onto the covered terrace. The sound of the rain was soothing now, washing away the toxicity of the evening. She locked the brakes on his chair and sat on the wicker bench beside him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just watched the rain fall on the perfectly manicured hedges. "You knew," Vivian said softly, breaking the silence. "You knew the whole time what they were planning." Alistair sighed, a sound that seemed to rattle in his old chest. "I suspected. A man doesn't build an empire without learning to spot a snake in the grass. But I didn't know if you would fight back." He turned his head to look at her. His eyes were clear, the cloudiness of feigned senility gone. "I gambled, Vivian. I treated you like a servant to see if you would leave. I let Richard bring that woman here to see if you would break. I needed to know." "Know what?" Vivian asked, looking down at her hands, the hands that had cleaned his glasses, organized his pills, and cooked his meals. "I needed to know if you were staying for the money or for the family," Alistair said. "Richard stayed for the money. He tolerated me because he saw a dollar sign attached to my pulse. But you stayed because you have honor. And tonight you showed me you have teeth." He reached out and patted her hand. His skin was paper-thin, but his grip was strong. "I don't know how to run a conglomerate, grandfather," Vivian admitted, the adrenaline fading, leaving her feeling small again. "I'm a housewife. I have a degree in art history I haven't used in 10 years. "Business isn't about knowing how to build the engine," Alistair said firmly. "It's about knowing where to steer the ship. You have decency, Vivian. That is the rarest commodity in the world. You'll hire the right people to do the math. You'll fire the vultures like Sterling. You will lead with a conscience." He chuckled darkly. "Besides, you handled Bella better than my head of security could have. I am revoking your invitation." "That was poetry, my dear. Pure poetry." Vivian looked down at her blue dress. The hem was stained dark with wine, heavy and ruined. She stood up and walked to the edge of the terrace. "I'm going to change," she said. "I think I'm done with velvet. Good, Alistair nodded. Wear the silk. It suits the CEO. 6 months later, the Montgomery Holdings skyscraper in Manhattan was a monolith of glass and steel reaching into the clouds. On the 40th floor, the atmosphere had changed. The sterile, terrified silence that used to permeate the hallways under Richard's reign of terror was gone. People were talking. There was energy. Vivian sat in the corner office. The grey leather furniture was gone, replaced by warm cream tones and navy accents. A vase of fresh hydrangeas sat on the desk, not roses. Sarah, the former maid from the Greenwich estate, walked in. She was wearing a sharp blazer and carrying a tablet. She was no longer scrubbing floors. She was the executive assistant to the CEO. "Mrs. Montgomery," Sarah said, tapping the screen. "The board of directors is ready for the quarterly review. Also, security sent up a report you might find interesting." Vivian looked up from a stack of files. Her hair was cut shorter now, a sleek bob that framed her face. She looked younger, vibrant. "What is it?" "A man attempted to access the lobby today without an appointment," Sarah said, trying to suppress a smirk. "He claimed to be a family consultant. Security recognized him. It was Richard." Vivian paused. She didn't feel the spike of fear she used to feel at his name. She felt nothing, just a mild curiosity. "What is he doing these days?" "According to the background check," Sarah read, "he is working as a shift manager at a car rental agency near the airport in Ohio. He lives in a studio apartment. He has multiple wage garnishments from outstanding credit card debt." "And Bella?" "Moved to Miami," Sarah replied. She tried to latch onto a tech billionaire, but apparently word travels fast in high circles. She was last seen promoting diet tea on social media to a few hundred followers. Vivian nodded slowly. "And grandfather?" "He's in the conference room already," Sarah smiled warmly. "He's teaching the new interns how to play poker." Vivian stood up. She smoothed her suit jacket, a crisp, white-tailored piece that looked nothing like the shadows she used to hide in. "Let him in," Vivian said. "Richard?" Sarah asked, surprised. "No," Vivian laughed, a bright, genuine sound. "Let Richard stay in the lobby. I meant the grandfather. Let him teach the interns. It's good for morale." She walked toward the door, then stopped at the mirror hanging by the entrance. She looked at her reflection. The sad, doe-eyed girl was gone. Staring back was a woman who had walked through the fire and came out holding the torch. "Sarah." "Yes, Mum." "Send a message to the lobby security," Vivian said, grabbing her file. "Tell Richard that appointments are reserved for shareholders only, and offer him a validation ticket for parking. I hear those rental car wages are tough." She walked out of the office, her heels clicking rhythmically on the marble floor, heading toward the boardroom to run her empire. And that, my friends, is the story of how Vivian Montgomery went from a bullied wife in the shadows to the CEO in the spotlight. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the quietest people are just waiting for the right moment to roar. Richard and Bella learned the hard way that when you strip someone of their dignity, you better be prepared for them to take everything else in return. What do you think of Vivian's final move? Was leaving Richard to work at a car rental agency enough justice, or should she have done more? And did Grandfather Alistair wait too long to step in? I want to hear your theories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this roller coaster of drama, revenge, and sweet justice, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder to stand up for themselves, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Thanks for watching, and remember, the best revenge is massive success.